Good afternoon, and welcome to today's webcast titled The Intellectual Property of Ebola and Zika, Lessons for Future Outbreaks. The webcast is presented by Professor Ana Santos Rutschman, a fellow in health law and intellectual property at DePaul University College of Law. Professor Rutschman's areas of interest are health law and intellectual property, including innovation policy and regulation in the life sciences. She recently consulted for the World Health Organization on the development of the Ebola and Zika vaccines. The webcast is sponsored by the New York State Science and Technology Law Center, which is located at the Syracuse University College of Law. I'm Molly Zimmerman, the Associate Director of the Center, and I'll be the moderator today. If you have questions as Professor Rutschman presents, please enter them in the chat box on your screen, and I'll bring them to her attention either during the presentation or at the end. Professor Rutschman, thank you very much for being here today.
Molly, thank you very much for having me. It's a delight to present in this webinar series. And could I just get a confirmation that you can hear me clearly?
Yes, absolutely. Loud and clear.
Perfect. As Molly mentioned, my talk today is about the intellectual property of Ebola and Zika, lessons for future outbreaks. But really, I should say this is a talk about the intellectual property of outbreak diseases, which share many characteristics, but also come in different varieties and flavors. So if instead of a law review article I were writing a novel, this would be sort of a Tolstoy novel in the sense that whenever things work well with IP, it's exactly like happy families. They all look the same, but when things derail, when we have unhappy families, they are very particular in their forms of unhappiness. And that's one of the main things that makes R&D and licensing issues in outbreak diseases so difficult. Every outbreak disease is underfunded in a particular way, and IP works differently from outbreak disease to outbreak disease. So this is a story of unhappy families that are very, very different. And part of my work is grouping them together and figuring out how we can address some common problems, not only to increase funding for these diseases, but to tackle some IP-related inefficiencies. And I'll explain what I mean by inefficiencies in the IP field in just a moment. So a story about Zika and Ebola based on Zika and Ebola case studies, but potentially applicable to most outbreak diseases, with the exception of 3 that I'll bring to your attention. So, let's see. If you are a reader of the New York Times, you might have come across fairly recently this Senator Sanders op-ed saying President Trump should avoid a bad Zika deal. The reason behind the op-ed being that the U.S. Army, which has developed what we think is a fairly effective, or actually probably very effective, Zika vaccine, is about to license that vaccine to a French pharmaceutical company, and there's been a lot of discussion about the terms for this license. That's something I'll come back to. Also, if you listen to All Things Considered, you might have listened to this episode. CDC issues new warning on the Zika virus ahead of mosquito season. So we've seen Zika retreating, not only geographically speaking, but also from the public mind and public discussions. But it's possible that with summer, we'll see new outbreaks of Zika in or close to the U.S. And if not Zika or Ebola, we know that there will be an outbreak soon. And we also know that there will be outbreaks more and more often as our lifestyles become increasingly globalized and people travel more, so the travel diseases. So the WHO and other institutions worldwide have lists of pathogens that are likely to emerge soon. And I'm going to show you the one recently put out by the WHO. So these are considered priority pathogens according to the WHO. And you can see a number of diseases that are probably familiar. So the second one from the left on the upper row, filoviruses diseases, that's the genus Ebola belongs to. So the WHO expects an Ebola outbreak in the near-ish future. If you look next to that, there's MERS and SARS, which are ongoing outbreaks as we speak. Then perhaps a couple of viruses most people are not that familiar with. And finally, bottom right side, an unknown severe infectious disease. So current predictive models do tell us that we'll have an outbreak, it will be serious, possibly lethal. We just don't know what the pathogen, the specific pathogen, will be. So this to tell you that we're trying to learn on many fronts from the back-to-back outbreaks of Ebola and Zika, and we know a couple of things for sure. We're going to have similar outbreaks in terms of public health impact, and we kind of estimate that Ebola is going to be one of the culprits for that, and we know some other possible pathogens, and we know we have some that will pop up, much like Zika did, that we can't really anticipate based on current predictive models. Then we have a second tier of pathogens that are predicted to emerge in the near future, but that won't be as severe as the outbreaks caused by the viruses listed on the previous slide. So the first two, some of you might have heard about these viruses. There have been outbreaks in the past, but notice that on the right side of the screen, the WHO is listing congenital and neurological problems associated with Zika virus. So these are predicted to be an ongoing concern. So Zika also predicted to be a chronic disease. That's what the WHO is calling it nowadays, pretty much like malaria. And so it has a heightened status compared to what had happened until now, in the situation in which most of us had not heard about Zika until 2015, and now it's going to acquire a status that's similar to malaria, and that, as we will see, as consequences from an IP perspective. And I'll get to those in a moment. Just to finish the introductory part, this is a graphic put together by the Centers for Disease Control. It shows the range of the two mosquitoes that we know for sure carry the Zika virus, and they are present in the U.S. As you probably remember, Florida, Puerto Rico were the areas most affected by Zika infection, the Zika outbreak. But this is as far as these mosquitoes are able to travel, particularly when the weather gets warmer, as it is about to. So notice that they can go as far as California, or as far north as New England, New York, etc. So a remarkable breadth of geographical coverage. So what does this all mean? It means that whatever we can learn from Zika and Ebola, from the back-to-back outbreaks, is potentially relevant to future outbreaks. It might not be applicable to the next outbreak if it occurs within a few months, as I'll explain in a moment. But some of the things that we saw with Ebola and Zika, we can count on observing similar phenomena in upcoming outbreaks. And what I'm doing today, and what I do in most of my research, is to look at IP inefficiencies. And I should explain what I mean by that. So most of you know of IP as a system of incentives. And as you can guess, in the case of outbreak diseases, incentives to R&D are particularly low, because most of these diseases are endemic to places in the world that do not have affluent populations. So pharmaceutical companies really don't have an incentive to spend a whole lot of money doing R&D on these diseases. And they are outbreak diseases, meaning they are unpredictable. So again, unhappy Tolstoyan story. Unhappiness here comes in two flavors. Either incentives to R&D in outbreak diseases are completely inexistent or discontinuous, and that's the case of Zika, that's the mosquito that you see on the bottom of the screen. Very, very little research done on Zika pre-2015. In some cases, however, there is some ongoing, sometimes intermittent R&D. That's what I'm calling minimally sustained incentives to R&D. So on the other side, you see one of the strains of the Ebola virus, and Ebola has been known since the 70s. So there's been some research going on, clearly insufficient. We still, to this day, don't have a therapy or a vaccine that's effective to deal with Ebola, but it's important to distinguish between these two incentives models. So IP as an incentives model affects, and I'll go into this in more detail in just a moment, but IP as an incentives model affects the pre-outbreak landscape and directly impacts the research and development status for outbreak diseases. More on this in just a moment. The two other stages at which intellectual property becomes relevant have nothing to do with incentives. They have to do with existing or emerging IP. So either you have a disease, an outbreak disease for which there's some discontinuous R&D, or you have no R&D whatsoever. If you happen to have some R&D, most likely there will be some patented technology, even if it's very early stage technology, and we'll see that with Ebola and Zika. There will be some intellectual property that needs further development, but it exists at the time of the outbreak. That's what I'm calling pre-existing IP. Most often, as we will see with the Ebola and Zika examples, pre-existing IP is done either by the public, is developed either by the public sector, or has been transferred or developed by small private sector entities. And this can be problematic. We're going to look at a case of intellectual property holdup in the context of Ebola vaccine licensing during the early stages of the Ebola outbreak. So IP can be problematic and function as a barrier during the early stages of the outbreak if we don't manage to transfer IP rights in an efficient way. So that's the second tier of IP effects on outbreak diseases. So we've moved from the pre-outbreak scenario to the early outbreak scenario. The third possibility, and some of the slides that I've shown you before, particularly the one where Senator Sanders cautioned President Trump on the licensing of the Zika vaccine, have to do with emerging IP. So one thing that we will see during stage one, so IP incentives to outbreak disease R&D, is that, as you would expect, incentives for R&D, they spike the moment an outbreak occurs. So usually we have very expedited development of patentable technologies during the early stages, mid stages of an outbreak, and that triggers the problem of transfer or exploitation of emerging IP. So this is the third layer. Outbreaks, they change the incentives landscape. I'll show you how profound that change was for Ebola and Zika R&D, and we had emerging IP. So you might have read about clinical trials that were very successful in the vaccine field, not necessarily in the therapy field, but in the vaccine field for Ebola and for Zika. And the Zika case study illustrates how emerging IP might be difficult to deal with. And by this, I mean that licensing of the vaccine might actually exclude some people from accessing the vaccine technology that was developed to combat, to fight the disease in question. So in this particular case, we'll see that what is happening to the licensing of the Zika vaccine right now might mean that not everybody will be able to afford it. So there are many question marks at this point regarding what will happen to the Zika vaccine, and I'll explain more broadly how this can affect licensing of emerging IP in a situation where incentives are artificially altered, and in which we have a lot of emerging IP to deal with in a pretty expedited context time. So I'll go back to stage one. IP as incentive, so mostly the role of IP in the pre-outbreak scenario. And just to be sure, this is what most people think of when we talk about IP as incentives, carrots. And this is true for outbreak diseases, it's true for non-outbreak diseases like cancer, it's true for lifestyle diseases. No matter how prevalent the disease is, no matter what the social burden or the health impact of the disease might be, if private sector actors do not have an expectation of recovering their R&D costs, and on top of that, possibly turning a profit, they will not invest substantial amounts of money and time on R&D for any type of disease. And most R&D is known for being extremely expensive, time-consuming. On top of sheer R&D, there are things like regulatory approval by agencies like the FDA or its counterparts elsewhere in the world. So we're talking about years for vaccine development. Estimates put the timeline at anywhere between 8 to 10 years and 14 to 15 years. So it's a huge time commitment. It's a huge monetary commitment, and it's a risky one because there's no guarantee that at the end of that process or at any point during that process, we won't find out that the R&D route that we're pursuing is not effective, it's unsafe, etc. In a moment, I'll show you the different types of R&D projects that the Ebola outbreak sparked, and you'll see just this variety of scientific approaches to the problem of how to cure Ebola and how to immunize people ex ante against Ebola infection. So the carrot idea works particularly in a particularly poor way, I would say, for outbreak diseases. Not only you have all your ordinary uncertainty that's just inherent to the R&D process, but you don't even know that the thing you'll be working on today will be relevant from a market perspective 10, 14 years from now. So there's an added layer of risk to the R&D enterprise. And this makes outbreak diseases especially risky and costly to invest in. And I'm going to illustrate this with Ebola first and then Zika. And this beautiful image here is of the Ebola River. That's where Ebola gets its name from. This is the area where it was identified for the first time. And it was identified in 1976. So we've had a few decades of ongoing R&D on Ebola. But as I hope you'll be able to see from the graphic that I just put up, the impact of Ebola outbreaks was minimal when compared to what happened in 2014. So this is an early outbreak graphic, actually. But you can see each number of each little human figure represents 500 people. So we have that times 5 during the entire period between Ebola being discovered and the 2014 outbreak. And suddenly 2014 outbreak happened, and you see how the numbers increase, and the darker shade of red represents actually people who died. So final numbers point towards over 10,000 people dying at the beginning of the outbreak, and I have some more numbers here. So by the time the outbreak formally ended, there had been 28,646 reported cases, over 13,000 people died, including the first Ebola-related death in the U.S. From a Liberian citizen, and there were a few flare-ups after the outbreak was over, and we have over 10,000 survivors, so 10,000 people who contracted Ebola but survived. So a pretty dire landscape, and something that had never been witnessed in recorded history. So Ebola is discovered, is considered a threat, and particularly after September 11, we'll see how that changed and actually bolstered R&D on Ebola. But again, it was one of those unhappy family disease. in the Tolstoyan story, right? Because no company was going to invest massive amounts of time on Ebola R&D. Why? Because again, 500 in areas of the world that are not particularly attractive if what you have in mind is recovering R&D costs. This changes in 2014. The geographical impact of the outbreak is not very different from what had happened before, so it's predominantly West Africa. There's one death, as I mentioned, in the US. And this is the timeline for Ebola R&D between when it was first discovered and just the pre-outbreak scenario. If you can't read all the small letters, I'll just tell you what the takeaway is that between 76 and 2014, we've discovered 5 different strains of Ebola. 4 of them cause symptoms in humans, and one of them only in, so far as we know, in non-human primates. So we have 4 lethal strains of Ebola that have been discovered through R&D conducted between 76 and the early 2000s. Outbreaks are episodic. Actually, we know of 5 different strains of Ebola, and there are no outbreaks for chunks, like 5-10 years for some of these strains. So Ebola is considered a severe disease. In some of these cases, mortality rates go up to 90%. In other cases, they're as low as 30 or 40%, if you can call that low. But this is pretty much the scenario, and this is what dictates intermittent, although ongoing, R&D on Ebola. We're concerned about it. It's just that it's confined to a region of the world that's not attractive from an investment perspective. And Ebola itself as an outbreak disease is episodic. It also has problems that are shared with any type of outbreak disease. So there's strain specificity. I've mentioned 5 different strains. What happens if you develop a vaccine that's effective against one type of Ebola but not against the other? So that adds to the risk component of R&D on outbreak diseases. Also, we have the problem of pathogen mutation. We'll see this with Zika as well, but again, vaccines take a really long time to develop. What if pathogens mutate during that period of time, thus rendering your vaccine less effective? A third thing that's common to all outbreak diseases is that there are usually low patient populations on which you can test your vaccine in order to gain regulatory approval. So by the time that outbreak-induced R&D is ready to be tested on patients, whether healthy or survivors of the outbreak, usually the population has shrunk. Either the outbreak has ended or is about to end. So again, this adds another layer of cost and uncertainty to R&D, and we'll see this also with Zika. There are, as I mentioned in my introduction, 3 diseases that sort of elude this model, and they are malaria and HIV/AIDS and tuberculosis. They are considered the top tier of outbreak diseases in the sense that they affect a geographical region of the globe that's wide enough to trigger sustained R&D. There are several ad hoc projects funding, for instance, the vaccine development in just the malaria field. Gates Foundation funds a lot of these projects. So there are 3 outbreak diseases that, although they share many of the characteristics of Ebola, Zika, SARS, MERS, etc., they are considered top tier. Again, they behave pretty much like Zika or Ebola do in the sense that they still affect regions of the globe that are considered economically unattractive for larger companies, but again, due to travel and to just the high health burden of these diseases, they attract investment in a way that neither Ebola nor Zika do. So one of the main consequences is that if you have a non-top tier outbreak disease, if there's any ongoing pre-outbreak R&D, it's likely to be done at state level, at country level, most often and not by some lab or institution that has some ties to either the Department of Defense or some institution that's interested in what we call medical countermeasures. So those types of technologies, such as vaccines that can be used in case there is a biological terrorist attack or something along those lines. So I'll explain this in more detail. So this is the pre-outbreak R&D for Ebola, which was done primarily by the Canadian government in the early 2000s. And you see 2003 up there. That's just a short 2 years after September 11. But if you are doing R&D on a disease that has some potential to be considered a material threat to a country's security, that's the most likely scenario for you to get funded in a pre-outbreak scenario. So we have the National Microbiology Labs in Canada doing research on something called the RVSV-VBOV vaccine, and I'll talk extensively about this vaccine, which was developed in Canada in the early 2000s, and in 2003, between 2003 and 2005, we see the U.S. Army Medical Research Institute of Infectious Diseases jumping in on R&D and conducting animal tests. And as I'll show you in a moment, this is part of this interest of the Army is due to post September 11 concerns with national security. But then something really strange happens. In 2005, preclinical results, so animal tests, are considered highly promising. And scientists in Canada and also in the US expect the vaccine, which at that point is the leading vaccine against Ebola in the world, they expect it to be licensed pretty soon. And they expect to have the vaccine fully developed, so gone through clinical trials and close to regulatory approval between 2010 and 2011. And in fact, in 2010, the Canadian government licenses the vaccine to NewLink Genetics. This is a small Ames, Iowa-based company that obtains rights over the IP of RVSV-VBOV for $205,000. And let's contrast this with the outbreak. So let's just go back. So NewLink has had the vaccine since 2010, and the outbreak occurs in 2014. Formally, the outbreak begins in January of 2014, although it is backtraced to late 2013. And in August, the WHO declares it a public health emergency. And I should mention at this point that the WHO was highly criticized for taking until August to declare the outbreak a public health emergency. So this was probably a late move by the WHO. And in November, NewLink licenses the vaccine to Merck for this amount, which comes from royalties, and I'll come back to these numbers in just a moment. And clinical trials for the vaccine begin. By 2015, in addition to the Canadian vaccine or the NewLink vaccine that I've just described, we have 12 vaccines being tested and 9 antiviral therapies. So at first sight, we actually have a vibrant R&D landscape prompted by the outbreak, as it should be, right? Pre-outbreak low incentives, an outbreak of the magnitude of the 2014 outbreak occurs, and suddenly we have a lot of companies, a lot of government, a lot of funders competing for the development of Ebola vaccines. And the charts that I have now illustrate that. I've tried to the best of my ability to group these vaccines in as many categories as possible. So first up, I have type of vaccines. So this is just to give you an idea of different scientific responses to the problem of developing an Ebola vaccine. So we have 5 different types of vaccines. The Canadian / New Link Iowa vaccine that I was talking about, and I'll come back to, is in the first group. It's the leading candidate for the first group of vaccines. And we'll see a couple other different approaches. I would call your attention to the fourth category, DNA vaccines, and I'll return to those in a moment. And you'll see that within each group we have multiple projects going on. And I can possibly describe all the projects in each group. So I picked the leading candidates as of now, and I'll show you how they developed in the post outbreak or during the early stages of the outbreak. So this is the Canadian vaccine that was developed in 2003, 2005 by the Canadian government and later sold for what I would consider a very low price to a small private sector company, really a startup in Iowa. The outbreak occurs and suddenly you can see the shift in the funding and collaboration landscape. So suddenly BARDA, the Department of Defense, the National Institutes of Health in the US, plus the Wellcome Trust in the UK are funding development of this vaccine. You can see it listed on the right side, the institutions that were involved in research and development, so the Public Health Agency of Canada pre-outbreak, and then Merck, which eventually gets the vaccine from New Link, and this is something I'll go back to in just 1 or 2 slides. And you also see the breadth of institutions involved in clinical studies and trials. This is not uncommon during an outbreak, particularly at the bottom of the slide. You'll see involvement by developing institutions in the developing world, and this just illustrates the geographical impact of Ebola. So Sierra Leone, one of the most affected countries by the outbreak. So this to illustrate that an outbreak of the magnitude of Ebola does change the incentives landscape and produces a realignment of interest. Suddenly you have, in addition to government and institutions that work on R&D related to bioterrorism and biosurveillance responses, all of those players suddenly are motivated to enter the R&D game and trigger what I would call a vaccine race. This is the second most developed, as of today, Ebola vaccine candidate, and you see that the landscape is not very different from what happened to the Canadian vaccine. Again, if you look to the right, the upper right corner of the slide, you'll see that Canada again was involved in R&D. This was pre-outbreak R&D, and eventually GlaxoSmithKline, so big pharma, and Okairos, a small pharmaceutical company that had been working on and off on vaccine development for some neglected diseases. So all these players come together when the outbreak occurs. Again, funding coming from US and EU institutions very quickly after the outbreak begins. And again, clinical studies and trials developed in partnership between institutions in the developing world and in this case in the EU. And this is a scenario that we're going to see also for the third most developed Ebola vaccine candidate. So we have Johnson & Johnson and Bavarian Nordic on the upper right corner. Again, big pharma stepping in. On this one, actually, we don't have US or Canadian government involved from the beginning, but NIH steps in pretty quickly once the outbreak begins. We have the Innovative Medicines Initiative. It's the largest health public private partnership in the EU and one of the largest in the world, so a major funder for this particular type of vaccine. And again, clinical studies and trials funded and developed by a combination of EU, US institutions plus institutions in the countries that have been affected by the outbreak. And I'll just go back for a moment. So this is a very good illustration of how intellectual property per se is insufficient to trigger the appropriate levels of pre-outbreak R&D, and also an illustration of how a catalytic effect like an outbreak changes that landscape and, most importantly, attracts private sector attention to R&D on these types of diseases. This is bad news in the pre-outbreak context because it tells us it's unlikely to change in the future. We can't predict what the next big outbreak will be, so we don't know what to fund. We cannot attract private sector attention before the next outbreak begins, but it's also good news in the sense that it seems that we can react pretty quickly. So mixed news here. IP, as we suspect, is not enough to ensure appropriate levels of R&D, but players seems to be coming together very quickly as soon as there's an outbreak. And for diseases like Ebola, the pre-outbreak landscape is aided somehow by the fact that they are considered a threat to national security. So in the wake of September 11, the Department of Homeland Security declared Ebola a material threat to national security in the U.S. This led HHS to add Ebola to the high priority pathogen list, and this is why in the charts that I showed above, you will see players like BARDA, the Army, the Department of Defense associated to Ebola R&D. So for diseases like Ebola, this is really, really good news. It means they will never have the episodic R&D that we associate with diseases like Zika, as we'll see in a moment. But it's also problematic. And here I'll move away from the incentives perspective to a different type of IP problem, which is IP inefficiencies that attach to pre-existing IP, so to pre-outbreak IP. And I'll go back to the vaccine that I showed you was developed during the early 2000s in Canada, and that got licensed a mere 4 years before the beginning of the big outbreak. So this is the RVSV-ZBOV vaccine that was developed in Canada, and that was considered one of the most promising strategies in Ebola R&D even before the outbreak, and it yet failed to attract substantial private sector attention. And what do I mean by this? So, as I showed you before, in 2011, NewLink, small Iowa-based company, acquired the rights to the vaccine for a low amount. And between 2011 and 2014, there was no clinical development of the vaccine whatsoever. This prompted newspapers like the New York Times, after the outbreak occurred, to look at what at R&D on Ebola before the outbreak and come up with headlines like this: Ebola vaccine ready for test, sat on shelf. And this was accurate. So if you look at the previous slide, 2011, NewLink acquires the rights to the vaccine, and it does nothing for the next few years. What's more troubling is that in 2013, the Ebola outbreak begins, and NewLink does nothing. So there's been no clinical development of the vaccine in the pre-outbreak scenario, which we can perhaps understand in the sense that NewLink would not predict that there would suddenly be a market for the outbreak. We might not understand that from other points of view, in the sense that we don't want to transfer IP rights, particularly when they are funded by public agencies and then have companies literally have the vaccines sit on a shelf. But from NewLink's perspective, it's less understandable that things are happening like WHO declaring a public health emergency, and yet NewLink is not entering into clinical development of the vaccine. What's even more troubling is that even after the WHO declared Ebola a public health emergency, Newlink refused to license the vaccine. There was widespread suspicions that Newlink could not develop the vaccine at that point. It was a small Iowa company and never engaged in this type of R&D, so we started suspecting that Newlink was unable to develop the vaccine, and yet Newlink would not license it during the acute stages of the outbreak. And I just should pause at this moment to explain that even if Newlink had licensed the vaccine, because of the time associated with vaccine development, it would have been useless for patient populations in the current outbreak. So in the 2014-2016 Ebola outbreak, had Newlink license, that would not mean a thing to those patient populations because the vaccine will only be of use to future outbreak populations. So the point is not that the delay in licensing the vaccine cost lives during the 2014-2016 outbreak. The point is that at the time where incentives for R&D and money going into Ebola R&D is being extensively focused on Ebola responses. So, for instance, between 2014 and 2016, funding overall worldwide for Ebola R&D went up by 258%. The problem is that when this happens, if you don't license, you're missing out on incentives for R&D. You're missing out on that critical window of time in which you actually have the resources to do in a couple months what you've not been able to do in 10 years or 20 years or 30 years. So it's not that per se the delay in licensing cost lives in 2014, but it actually might cost us lives down the road if the incentives disappear, as you probably can predict they did fairly soon after the outbreak ended, and if populations on which to test the vaccine also shrink towards the end of the outbreak. So this is what's really problematic with this refusal to license. So at the time in which incentives and money streams are opening up, Newlink is holding up the IP of the most promising Ebola vaccine in the world. As you can imagine, there was pressure from the WHO, the NIH, the Canadian government, and eventually Newlink transferred the rights to Merck, so big pharma, for $30 million plus $20 million due at the time clinical testing begins. From an IP perspective, you might suspect why this is problematic. So a company that acquires IP for a really low price in a pre-outbreak scenario doesn't do anything, does not add to the R&D pool, so to speak, and yet is able to sell the technology that it acquired without adding anything to it for 30 million plus 20 million. So it's a windfall for the small company and something that we don't want to incentivize. In the future, I'll go back to this when I talk about solutions for some of these inefficiencies. And I'll just note that Merck, once it obtained the rights over RVSV-Bob, was able to start clinical trials within 2 months. Again, if we look at the timeline for the outbreak, this is not a lot of time. If you think of a 2-month delay or a delay between August and November when Merck actually begins the clinical trials. But if you consider the outbreak as a catalyst for incentives and for funding streams, then this is highly, highly problematic. The story with Zika is similar yet different. So we're going to see some of the same inefficiencies in the pre-outbreak scenario, and then we're going to see some IP-related inefficiencies with emerging IP. So I'll do the same thing I did with Ebola. I'll just show you what the status of R&D was for Zika before the outbreak, and then we'll see how the outbreak complicated the mix of incentives to R&D and what it did to emerging IP negotiations. And here you have a picture of the Zika forest. So this is where Zika was identified for the first time, and actually it was identified before Ebola in the 40s. And we suspect we had many more Zika outbreaks than the ones that are accounted for, because Zika was not associated with any particularly terrible symptoms Before 2015, it's highly likely that Zika outbreaks went underreported throughout the 20th century, but these are the ones that we know of um, before the 2015 outbreak. Um, and I'll pull this map now. If you look at the areas highlighted in purple, you see Eastern Africa, 1947 there. That's the beginning of um, Zika, recorded Zika outbreaks, 1947. And then there have been episodic Zika outbreaks registered throughout Africa. And then we move towards Asia. You see India there and southern Asia. You see in 2007 an outbreak in the Yap in the South Pacific. You see 2014 in Indonesia, and then 2014 South Pacific, New Caledonia. 2013 French Polynesia. So the virus is migrating towards Asia and South Pacific, and this is where scientists now believe the virus that eventually exploded in Brazil in 2015 incubated for a while. If you remember anything from 2014, the Olympics took place in Brazil. So we now suspect that tourism to Rio de Janeiro and other Brazilian cities for the Olympics might have played a really important role in bringing the virus from French Polynesia or New Caledonia to Brazil. And there, the virus really propagated really quickly throughout Southern and Latin America. So in 2015, we have a major outbreak in Brazil. And unlike the previous outbreaks, the one I've mentioned before, this one came with more severe symptoms that we identified for the first time. So Guillain-Barré, which is a severe neurological disease, was first confirmed in July in association with Zika infection. Or suspected, I should say, in July, and same thing with microcephaly, so newborns with abnormally low head size being the numbers for those spiked in Brazil in early 2015, and in October there was a suspicion that that might be related to Zika infection. Then World Health Organization was much faster in declaring the outbreak of public health emergency. So that happened in February, and it lasted until November of last year. Although Zika was known to scientists before Ebola was and had been studied earlier than Ebola ever was, there was virtually no R&D to show for on Zika. It remained a niche interest for a handful of scientists around the globe, so there were no Zika diagnostics or therapeutics or vaccines or vector control methods until 2015 when the outbreak began. If you fast forward 1 year, we have 4 booming areas of Zika R&D. We have diagnostics that now we actually know were not very successful. The 2015-16 development is not very successful. We have therapeutics, also not particularly successful, but we have vaccines. And as of now, and these numbers keep changing, and I keep updating them, but as of now, there are over 20 R&D projects for Zika vaccine development alone. And these we estimate to have actually products hitting the market fairly soon, within a couple of years. So diagnostics, therapeutics, and vector control methods did not get the majority of funding, yet a number of projects boomed after the outbreak, and there was a true vaccine race, much along the lines of what we observed with Ebola. So the charts here are different a little bit. The makeup is slightly different. We have countries like India, Brazil, and South Korea involved in outbreak-induced R&D. And I'm just going to go through this chart fairly quickly because some of these projects we don't know that they'll ever approach the later stages of clinical trials, but some of them have been very, very successful. And as we saw with Ebola, we have different types of research and sometimes the same institution funding different types of this research. So for instance, if you look at the third line, the Butantan Brazil project, they are funding two different types of vaccines. One line above that, three different types of vaccines, inactivated vaccines and DNA vaccines, and I'll go back to that distinction in just a moment. And the chart continues. You see at the top New Link Genetics benefiting from the windfall from the transfer of IP rights to their Ebola vaccine, now funding also some R&D on Zika. We see the NIH and NIH again repeat Zika, Ebola players involved in Zika R&D with multiple approaches, three different types of Zika R&D funded through public money in the US. You see Sanofi, which is going to become a prominent player in just one moment. And finally, the Army in the US developing a project with the NIH and NIH for something that is known as the SPIV vaccine, which is a purified inactivated virus vaccine, and is the one I'm using as a case study for Zika because it's also the leading vaccine candidate for Zika. You see also a couple of institutions that have either inactive or early stage projects. So this is based on information communicated to the WHO of institutions saying they might be beginning some Zika related project in the near future. So we go from having known of the Zika virus longer than we have been aware that Ebola exists, but having no R&D to show for, to early 2017, over 20 vaccine projects going on, and we have three top candidates emerging. I'm going to call your attention to the one highlighted in green. That's the Army vaccine. That's considered the most advanced candidate. And then we have two other vaccine candidates that took a very different approach. So the Army vaccine followed a more traditional pathway to vaccine development. It's a purified inactivated virus. Whereas the other two leading projects, so Inovio and GeneOne, it's US South Korea partnership, and then the NIH vaccine, those are DNA-based vaccines. And I don't have the time to go into the differences between DNA and non-DNA vaccines, but the only thing I will note is that DNA vaccines are considered a riskier R&D pathway. We know much more about inactivated vaccines than we know about DNA vaccines, and they have not been a popular pathway in outbreak disease R&D. But the fact that two of the leading candidates are now DNA-based vaccines suggests that one of the ways in which intellectual property incentives are altered also reflects on the willingness of players to fund R&D that would not be popular in the pre-outbreak scenario. So some good news brought about by the Zika outbreak and the ways in which it changed the landscape for Zika R&D. But as I mentioned, the leading candidate is the Army's vaccine, the inactivated one, so the more traditional vaccine. And you'll see how traditional the pathway for developing this type of vaccine is by considering the following. So in 2009, the Army, which now is the leading Zika vaccine candidate, developed a vaccine for Japanese encephalitis, which is in the same genus as Zika, so both flavivirus. In 2016, in January, the Army made the decision to enter the Zika vaccine race. And the way it did that was by making a decision to use the 2009 Japanese encephalitis vaccine technology to create a vaccine that would target the Zika virus specifically. So the idea is take that you already have, apply it to a disease within the same family or genus, right? And the decision is made in April to use this vaccine technology, and results are ready for submission to Nature in May, so a month of R&D. Clinical trials began in November. So this is an incredibly compressed timeline, as you can probably um, tell, and it just shows that when incentives align, then the period of 8 to 10 to 15 years actually shrinks, and it's possible to have new IP emerging pretty soon. It's also a suggestion that we could have developed a vaccine for Zika much sooner than we did. Apparently, the technology existed. The results for these clinical trials are actually very promising. So again, mixed news. We could have done this much sooner. We possibly could have prevented this outbreak. We just didn't have the right incentives. And I'm not saying this is just an IP problem. Again, there was a lot of scientific unknowns associated with the Zika vaccine. But it gives you a picture of how incentives realign during an outbreak, and particularly how sometimes what we conceive of as a very, very long and costly process, R&D process, actually might be a month away from just developing existing technology. So this is both good and bad news from the Zika case study. And now a little bit more of bad news, unfortunately. So when you take the step of developing technology that you have and apply it to a different disease, you create new intellectual property. And although this is the Army, so it's federally funded research, and although it's federally funded research, we've known since the 80s that that's not an obstacle to acquisition of intellectual property rights. So, in other words, what I mean is, since the Bayh-Dole Act in the U.S., it is possible to patent federally funded research, and this is what happened with the Army Zika vaccine. So, what you have in front of you is a notice given by the Army saying that since we've had very successful clinical trials for this Zika vaccine, we are going to license it to Sanofi Pasteur, French large pharma company. And this is the entirety of the notice that appeared late last year in December. And this is all we know about the license that the Army is about to give Sanofi Pasteur for the commercial development of the vaccine. So we have the leading worldwide, we have the leading Zika vaccine candidate, which was funded with federal money, and we now have a notice by the Army saying that it will give Sanofi an exclusive royalty-bearing revocable license on two different patents. So we have emerging IP now being transferred. And I'll just finish by looking a little bit more closely into this license. And again, that was the text that you saw before was the whole notice. This is all we know about the license, and I'll just explain briefly why this is problematic. So we know from the text that it's an exclusive license. The patent code establishes that federally owned inventions, they can be subject to exclusive licenses if, and only if, exclusivity constitutes a reasonable and necessary incentive to, one, call forth the investment capital and expenditures needed to bring the invention to practical application, or number two, if it promotes the invention's utilization by the public. So we have these two pieces of information, this requirement that the Army needs to comply with, and the fact that it's an exclusive license. Here's what we don't know. We don't know if the vaccine will be commercialized in a way that is affordable and that will guarantee that people throughout the US and possibly the world will be able to afford these vaccines in the future, because the Army has not disclosed any pricing provisions, no royalty rights, no access provisions, no information on termination provisions, data sharing provisions to enable follow-on R&D, nothing. Which is also problematic because, again, the patent code establishes that a vaccine has to be available to the public on reasonable terms. So completely opacity from the army, which actually was a matter of public discussion between late December, when the notice appeared for the first time, and last month. That is the period for public comments on the vaccine, and a lot of people waiting. You saw at the beginning of this presentation the headlines from Senator Sanders' contribution, and a lot of institutional players contacted the Army and said there's a host of problems with the notice that you put out. We don't understand why exclusivity is necessary when there's been already federal money going into this vaccine. We don't see why a private company would necessarily need to develop the vaccine on an exclusive basis. That has the potential to rise prices, diminish competition, exclude patients from accessing the vaccine. So please do share more information. Please add a pricing safeguard to the vaccine. Please consider non-exclusive licenses. And just a few days ago, the Army replied that they can't add a pricing safeguard to the vaccine, and they see no need to. They believe that Sanofi will be able to commercialize the vaccine in a way that's fair without any of these provisions, which remains highly doubtful. And this really calls attention to the third IP problem. So we create IP incentives because without those, we assume that even in the face of outbreaks that might raise the level of incentives and funding that attaches to R&D on a particular disease, we think that's just not enough. Just public concern or health burden of a disease or interest in a disease spiked by an outbreak, we think that's not enough if at the end of the R&D process we can patent the result. And again, there's a whole lot of debate surrounding this proposition, but it seems to be true in many cases. You're not going to be able to attract private sector attention if patents are not on the table. That's just the status quo, and this is not what my presentation or my paper are about. But even if you accept that that's the pre-outbreak scenario, there are still two other moments in which IP can become problematic, even when you've solved part of the incentives puzzle. So if you have an outbreak and suddenly you have the resources to engage in expedited R&D, as we saw with the Ebola vaccine, there are still problems that attach to pre-existing IP. So there can be a hold-up situation, as we saw in the case of the Ebola vaccine. Further along, especially when the expedited R&D timeline really works, and that seems to be the case with Zika, you can have IP problems, IP inefficiencies with emerging IP. And I'm sure that we'll hear more about the Zika license to Sanofi in upcoming weeks and months, but the indications are not good at this point. So we have a federally funded invention that was expedited due to heightened outbreak-induced incentives. And we face a scenario in which a large pharmaceutical company will likely be able to commercialize this vaccine in monopoly-like conditions, which raises costs, diminishes competition, so might exclude population abroad, even in the US, from accessing this vaccine in the future. So the question is, now what, right? You have identified three types of problems. How do we fix all this? And I would suggest that I would actually take any questions you might have on this during the Q&A, but I'll just mention briefly what some of the options are. So at the incentives level, there are a number of things being done. The obvious answer is we need more money, right? We need more money to deal with uncertain research, and that's unlikely to happen unless you're one of those top 3-tier diseases. There's been a program at the FDA that seeks to reward private companies doing research on neglected diseases, and Zika and Ebola are eligible for this. I personally think this is not going to trigger a lot of Zika or Ebola or even outbreak disease-related R&D, but we see some emerging mechanisms that focus on neglected diseases, of which outbreak diseases are a part, and we see some non-IP incentives. So I'm sure that you must have heard at some point about the Cancer Moonshot or the Precision Medicine Initiative. for other types of diseases, and I've mentioned some ad hoc initiatives for malaria development. So Zika, Ebola might in the future benefit from some non-IP incentives, so projects that center around developing therapies or vaccines for these diseases, and just attract funding from entities like Gates, for instance, which has been one of the most prominent funders of neglected disease R&D. This is obviously not going to solve the problem, but might mitigate the problem. Then you have the problem of early stage licensing when there is an outbreak, so pre-existing IP. One of the things that I'm proposing is that we perhaps look into model agreements for pandemic outbreaks. So whenever there's a potential hold-up situation, we can just have a model agreement that says if a company is not really licensing the technology that it has acquired and it has not added anything to that technology, here's a model agreement, and we'll have some sort of dormant license that will become active in a situation of hold-up. And again, I'm happy to elaborate on this during the Q&A. And then finally, for late-stage licensing, so emerging IP like the one we're now seeing for the vaccine, for the Zika vaccine, obviously an easy solution would be to add to the provisions in the patent code something that would say, well, we need mandatory price termination data provisions just to clarify. Just to give the general public and interested parties in particular more information on potentially on agreements that will potentially exclude populations in need from technology based on outbreak emerging IP. So in a nutshell, this is my presentation. And I'm seeing a couple of questions popping up already, and I'll just take the one that I have.
And if you want, and give you a chance to hear them and think about them, so you have to do both. One is what was the effect of the Army publishing the results? I think it said in Nature on the IP and the ability to commercialize it. Another question is, do you know how the government determined which company to grant the license to, Sanofi in that case? And third, the understanding about Bayh-Dole and Martin rights is that they've never been exercised because the government doesn't want to kill the incentive by utilizing them. But it would seem that would be an appropriate use when there's a public health emergency. So I know those are all three. There's another place? Okay.
Okay, yes. So thank you. And those are all very thoughtful comments. And some of my answers might not be entirely satisfactory because there's, again, a lot of opacity when we look at some of the things that are going on. But I'll do my best to address the 3 points you've made. So publication of results in Nature. Definitely, that was one of the moments that propelled this vaccine to its leading position. The thing is that the results report that preclinical testing has been very effective, and we have reasons to believe that clinical testing is going to be successful. But they don't disclose enough information about the patented technology. So if what you're interested in is the patent bargain, we're giving the Army these sets of rights in exchange for the information on the vaccine. You're not getting that from the Nature article. You'll get that from the patent disclosures, hopefully when you're able to access those. So the immediate effect of the Nature article is, one, to signal that this is the leading candidate, and the scientific community is aware of that. But beyond that, I mean, there were suspicions that this vaccine, even before that, would be successful. I think what was really, really impressive is the condensed timeline in which it was develop. But that's the effect of the Nature publication. Um, that leads the government to decide to allocate part of the upcoming R&D process to a private company. And this is very common. As I mentioned, increasingly there's debate about how do we change this landscape in which governments kickstart R&D, and then we need to rely on private sector every single time to finish up that R&D. And I don't think anybody has the answer how to delink that model. But the decision of the government in this particular case is consistent with what we've seen in the past. It's Merck, Sanofi, GlaxoSmithKline. They are traditional recipients of licenses on government-developed technology. So Sanofi, in particular, as far as I know, benefited from, I'd say, two sets of factors. Sanofi was working even before the army. Sanofi was working on Zika vaccine development. The project was not exactly similar to the army's, but it was already part of the race. So that would make Sanofi more appealing that a company that was not part of that race to begin with. And second, Sanofi had already been funded by a couple of agencies, including some in the US, to do R&D on Zika. So I think that puts it up in a very good place. And again, this is an ongoing process. I don't know of any other factors that have rendered Sanofi more appealing than other companies. But certainly these were two things that played in favor of Sanofi faster. As far as the vital question goes, you're absolutely correct that marching rights are part of the act, but they have not been used in the past. And we see no indication from the government that they'll do so. Not even for Zika or Ebola, but in the near future. The NIH specifically, which again was involved in the development of this vaccine too, the NIH specifically seems to disfavor this approach. And yes, do I think they would be a good solution? I would, but they're just in the current political economy, they don't appear to be favored. So I don't expect marching rights to pop up at any time during the Zika or Ebola vaccine development process. So possible, yes. Likely to happen, no.
Understandable. I mean, I think that is part of what I've always understood was the fear is that it would take away the carrots that you spoke about if companies began thinking that. The final question is, can compulsory licensing resolve this problem? And if so, how should the terms of the license be set?
Could it solve the problem? Again, very politically unappealing mechanism.
Can I didn't say the whole thing. That one issue is capacity constraints for manufacturing.
I'm sorry, I missed that. One issue is
capacity constraints for manufacturing. So can compulsory licensing resolve this problem? And if so, how should the terms of the license be set?
So again, compulsory licensing is a very charged concept. In theory, we have all these tools, public health tools that should alleviate some of the IP inefficiencies. But if you say compulsory licensing, most people will think of TRIPS Article 31 developing country situation. It still would not, I don't think, would address many of the concerns we have in the US, and a lot of the concerns, for instance, around the Zika vaccine licensing agreement have to do with US taxpayers who funded the vaccine already once, now paying more for it if they want to access it. So I'm going to split the answer into two, so US market and non-US markets. Yes, compulsory licensing is a powerful tool, particularly in international IP. And when we look at markets like the ones in West Africa that would arguably benefit the most from Ebola vaccines, um, and yes, that would be a very good option for when manufacturers don't have the capacity um, to push the vaccines through the pipeline. Um, the case study on Ebola referred to a different problem. Clearly, New Link in Iowa could not conduct clinical trials and, in essence, could not manufacture the vaccine. But this is something that I think occurs even before we start discussing compulsory licensing. I think compulsory licensing would come into play during stage 3, so late stage licensing problems surrounding fully finished or almost finished vaccines like the Zika vaccine. I think they would potentially be of use for markets in places like Africa, but as you know, they remain a disfavored mechanism. There's a number of things that you need to show, and we just don't see a whole lot of compulsory licensing. So, theoretical tool, check. If it's going to happen, that's not where I'd put my money on, which is why I'm trying to come up with other solutions to the problem. So how do you make sure that licenses of emerging technologies actually, well, I guess it's not even actually that they contain the terms that, fair terms, let's just call it that, but also that people like us in academia and people at institutions, say like Knowledge Ecology International, which did a lot of work surrounding the Army Zika vaccine, and people in think tanks, NIH and other institutions, we all think about this. As far as I can tell, the only way you can actually achieve some degree of change is that if you have a requirement that whenever you license to private sector, and private sector, again, in large private sector seems to be the one that so far has shown the ability to cover that, the last miles of the vaccine, right? So if we agree that the IP system is designed in the way that eventually one of these players will get called in, which is my perspective, and you just want to minimize the effects of IP rights being in the hands of players like these, which again are necessary. So I'm not just criticizing their involvement in the problem, just recognizing that it will occur again and again. So when you're in this scenario, what can we do? And my perspective is, well, there's an unappealing solution. That's what I meant by the dormant license. Maybe you could have something that companies agree on, and if there's an intellectual property holdup, they've already agreed to the terms of the licensing. This could apply to smaller companies that acquire IP from governments, so federally funded research, and they're given a shot um, at developing the vaccine. But if they fail, they're already terms pre-established, and then um, the IP could easily be transferred during the early stages of an outbreak. And then number two, if we're talking about late stage licensing, so again, the Zika vaccine type of situation, then my proposal is that simply, in addition to saying you must specify if it's an exclusive license or not in your this when you give notice of the intent to license, here are 2 or 3 provisions that we require you to elaborate on. So price provisions in general, or termination provisions or date, and we could just pick 1 or 2 that we think are really, really important. I think incorporating that into the Patent Act, yes, it would be politically complicated, but it would be the most efficient way of addressing this problem.
Well, Anna, I know I speak for everyone in thanking you for a really excellent, thought-provoking presentation. Just some housekeeping items. We will post the webcast within 2 weeks. We can send it to you first if you'd like. And secondly, have you already forwarded the PowerPoint? Because if it's okay with you, we'll post that along with the webcast.
I have not forwarded him. I will do so as soon as I hang up.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you again for having me, and thank you for the questions, which do help me, to think more about the problems and how to go about that.